So it'd be awesome just to learn a little bit more about, your involvement with fintech broadly, and then also what you do today. And that'll help frame, I think, the rest of the conversation.
Yep, perfect. So I think it's probably easy to start. So I took a job at Fidelity in about 2010, and at that point, the fintech revolution hadn't really started in any form or format, right? So it's sort of early days, but it was an interesting time, largely because there was sort of a growing desire to get more technology to the consumer, right? And that was sort of on the heels of the financial crisis of 2008. So there's a number of things that sort of played into that. But so I joined Fidelity in 2010, spent 7 years inside of Fidelity Labs and the Fidelity Center for Applied Technology. Those organizations have morphed and aggregated and disaggregated over time. But really, that was sort of the innovation function within Fidelity that was charged and mandated to go think outside the normal business lines, think about how do we bring new technology in and essentially accelerate the adoption of cost cutting techniques on the enterprise IT side, but really get closer to the customer as well, right? Because Fidelity has sort of a complex business model in that regard. So I spent 7 years in finance on the tech side at Fidelity, and was lucky enough to sort of see a lot of good companies come through our pipeline as the team and I we were really scouting for new technologies that we could bring into the enterprise architecture leadership, as well as other parts of the business as like a bolt-on business model. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of opportunity on the enterprise side. So new technologies like Twilio and whatnot that we could identify as up and comers, and .cloud, which became Docker, is another example of that. Like companies that were fundamentally changing the way that architecture was working in, and finance was under some pressure at the time, obviously in the sort of post-crisis time. So that was my background on that. I have an IT background otherwise, but early on, sort of have that thesis of all ag tech is fintech, and that margins matter. And so in that world, I thought it was interesting that we did start to see some businesses really thinking about how do you increase the margin for the farmer, right? That grower and producer finding ways to provide higher level of service with less friction, but also find another value pool to open up. So sort of did a number of consulting engagements, invested privately, and then ended up at Leaps by Bayer, which is an awesome place. Been here for 18 months.
Awesome. And what do you do there? I mean, I think most people probably know you, but just to give that full background.
Yeah, so small, lean team. So Leaps is a separate division within Bayer. I've got colleagues that are healthcare and pharma related. There are 3 of us that are very focused on the crop science side. So think sort of legacy Monsanto plus the Bayer ag business sort of came together. We inherited the Monsanto Growth Ventures portfolio. So Derek Norman and PJ Amini, the 3 of us essentially are the investors. As a director of venture investments, we lead deals. We participate as follow-on investors. In the right situations, we essentially follow other financial investors that find a company valuable in the ag space, and participate in rounds that range from like a joint venture and formation, seed. Series A tends to be our sweet spot, all the way to essentially a Series C level. We typically don't do growth equity, so the Series D crossover and beyond is sort of outside our scope. We operate as a corporate venture group, but really organized as an impact investing organization. So as an organization, the team has $1.2 billion deployed, really thinking about fundamental shifts in technology and business model. So we are not looking for step change opportunities. We're looking for sort of big disruption. And of course, that's one of the Bayer's levers of change, is to go out and learn, de-risk, but also participate and add momentum to obviously a fast changing environment.
Right. No, and then how similar or different to that is the thesis and the model from when you were investing in fintech companies? Are you trying to support the mother business, or is it a little bit more independent than it was previously?
Yeah, so as I'd say, my experience, sort of as an independent investor, as an angel investor, I was focused only in ag tech. Within Fidelity, the group that I sort of led and managed was a global business unit inside the labs organization. Fidelity spun up, and the F Prime and 8 Roads organizations, especially the 8 Roads existed before as Fidelity Growth Partners Europe and Asia. have a long history that predates even my sort of existence at Fidelity. But the ability to sort of see fintech options as an investing thesis, and then enterprise IT broadly. David Jagan and the team at F Prime really leaned in hard on that and made a number of really great bets. Probably about 2011 and onwards. So not being part of the formal F Prime team, but really being part of that ecosystem. We work collaboratively in terms of identifying deal flow and then finding those enterprise IT and fintech. Everything from payments all the way through frankly enterprise IT DevOps solutions. So they had a pretty broad remit, but also very selective. And that perfect timing from a fintech standpoint. So a lot of vision and commitment from Fidelity to make that happen.
Yeah, that's awesome. And how, one thing that I think about a lot is like, fintech obviously in the past, I'll say 10 years, probably a little bit longer, has exploded, right? And it's just gone through this amazing kind of, renaissance. Do you think something similar is possible in agriculture? And do you think that there's like with that experience in the very early days of fintech, do you get any sense that, where we are as a stage in the ag tech industry, are there triggers, are there changes that you would say, this is like 2010 in fintech, right? Ag tech today, or anything like that?
So we could definitely pattern match. So if you sort of look at the fintech landscape, if you go down to that sort of early days, so the New York Innovation Lab and the fintech, essentially class was one of the early examples. Maria Gotch and that fintech innovation lab focused on fintech were really, a lighthouse in the early days. Like their understanding of how fintech was going to evolve really amplified and created a baseline and really a community of folks working together on that. They were really smart. They were able to get capital from essentially a number of the big New York banks, right? So then they had banking investments, and those banking, sort of as a LP into the fund, were also committed to the program that they ran, which is sort of akin to sort of a Techstars FinTech or other incubation program. But they were really one of the first ones focused on fintech. The other part of pattern matching, that's probably worth bringing up, and then we'll bring it back to ag tech, is that the large sort of organizational segmentation of, at that point, institutional or investment banks, they were committed partially through that New York City FinTech Innovation Lab, but also through their own endeavors to find that level of innovation and invest in it. So Goldman clearly had an investment arm that was doing that from the early days, but doing it more collaboratively and finding that, in this space, you could choose horses with legs, but not necessarily choose the horse, meant that like the biz dev functions with innovation and investors could operate collectively. And that was great because there's folks like John Lair, who were at Morgan Stanley, and Tim Lyons, Morgan Stanley, then, later at Bank of America. These folks really built that community of collaboration. And that meant that we could sit down together as peers to say, hey, what are you doing for this solution, whether it be chat or cybersecurity or data management? And it didn't feel as though we were strictly competitive because there was enough room and sort of a timeline of adoption that we just wanted to help founders like get off the ground, put good solutions in the market, and then let them adapt, and find their own product market fit. Ag is very similar in that case, right? Sort of large segmentation. If you were to think about large investment banks, you could look at the ABCDs and find analogies there. You could look at the ag input, sector, look at BASF and Bayer and others, from a chemistry and seed standpoint, and Corteva and C. Over the years, there's been some, aggregation of value in terms of acquisitions, but there's also been opportunity to sort of build larger foundational value pools. So I found that there's a lot of commonality in terms of the market structure. Big global businesses working on fractional margins, and then also thinking about large volume transactions. That's ag in a nutshell in many cases. And then to tie that back to sort of that financial crisis of, sort of 2008, 2009 being sort of a place to start for that FinTech Innovation Lab. I might even posit that the global pandemic, is that in some sort for us as well, right? There's supply chain pressure, there's marketing, grain marketing pressure, there's, transportation pressure. And all those things are asking us in the ag sector, how do we do our jobs better? Where are the efficiencies to be had? And obviously there's a number of ag innovation organizations, from incubators to accelerators, that do a really great job of really pulling the thread and really connecting, big companies and finding that, say, the 3 or 4 right people, like Cargill and what Brett does, in Minneapolis, and put the right people in the room to make a difference for a founder. And that really matters in ag, because it's sometimes a black box for folks that are not coming from an ag sector, right? So if you're not coming from an ABCD or not coming from input, it might be hard to like step off the street and say, I'm going to revolutionize ag. I think it's a worthy cause, and for anyone that's willing to do it, there's room. There's certainly there's a seat at the table.
Yeah, we think about that a lot. That's fascinating though, and I love that parallel where you're thinking pandemic, global financial crisis as kind of this trigger. That would put the stage of ag tech's development as, I mean, like prehistoric, right? Like it's just at the very, very start.
I think we benefit from a number of seed funds, being formed, right? That analogy doesn't hold true when you start looking at the funds, financial funds that have been raised, and
right,
the corporate funds that have been participating in the ag sector. Holistically, I'd say that the ag tech sector, from a timeline perspective, is 5 to 8 years delayed off the fintech, somewhere in that range. But there were some early visionaries, and you look at Andy and Ron and what they did at Cultivian to raise capital, really, and start a sector of investing that really matters. And they're still around today, and they're still active participants in boards, and we all look up to them as folks that really have understood that there's a sort of an inflection point in the food and ag sector, and are experts in their field. And there's other seed stage funds that get capital to founders when it's a seed stage debt note, and that matters too, right? Because a little bit of capital goes a long way when you're a founder, and that's not the sweet spot necessarily for all corporates. We're looking for a little bit of traction and revenue, usually, and that opportunity to get founders off that first step means there's a lot of momentum, and the ecosystem takes shape, and that segmentation of investors really, it requires sort of a full breadth. That's where ag tech, I think, is a step ahead of where fintech was, because there are early stage investors willing to put capital in at an early stage, like Dean and Yana at Innova, all the way through Sanjeev and Christina and team at S2G. They're willing to put capital to work early and take that risk, because they know the thesis and they know the marketplace. So I think that's where it took fintech a while to get a number of early stage, seed and Series A funds up that were financial VCs. There was a fair bit of reliance on the corporate VC side ahead of time, and I think we're a little bit healthier on the ag side, actually.
Oh, absolutely, right, and we benefit from that too, right? With both having like Andy's guidance, right, with our board in Cultivian, but also through like LP introductions, right? Those funds are very well connected in the agriculture industry, so that has been a big boost. And I agree, it's super important in building those first iterations as well,
Yep.
right? Getting that proximity to the market. Interesting.
And we've actually cycled through it to the point where Andy could say, I've seen this before. It worked for these reasons, or it didn't work for that reason. So, at some level, we're, maybe in a second iteration where there's, some good lessons learned. It's not just a wild west of opportunity. Ag is a very relationship-driven, sort of entity, right? It's relationships matter, and long-term wins the game. And so, we're committed to building those relationships within Bayer too, right? And that's about helping the sector advance. And if it's not this round, it's the next one, and let's play the long game. And you look at the early sort of, like I said, the lighthouse venture funds, they've done that very well, right? Because that relationship matters over time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so in the early days of fintech, were the things coming out, did they seem kind of crazy? Or were there any that just, the whole concept of these companies becoming, banks like neobanks, or even taking, things like, I mean, TransferWise, right? Or do like managing payments, like, did the idea that those kinds of companies would compete with the incumbents, like, was that completely out of the question, or was that something where internally at Fidelity you felt like a little bit pressured, or you wanted to partner with them really early? What was that like? Because I know in agriculture, very
Yeah.
often, the large companies are very receptive. I think a lot of these up and coming companies, but at times there's a little friction, a little tension, right? A little uncertainty as how things will play in the market. Uh,
Yeah.
it'd be really interesting to hear that that relationship in
That,
fintech.
that tension existed in fintech too, right? I remember, sort of early days on a number of, sort of brokerage type platforms. And, I'll just say, when Google and Andreessen go in on a brokerage platform that's free and, allows you to do fractional share trading, and, inside a larger organization that runs a big retail brokerage, we couldn't do fractional trading at that point. And so, our constraints were built upon mainframe and efficiency, but all of a sudden there's a new startup and we're thinking, have they refactored brokerage, right? Have they figured out how to put brokerage in the cloud? And there's a lot of sort of early stage conversations around like did we just turn the corner? And uh, the answer was, at that point it was not in the cloud, because brokerage is a very expensive thing to do, because you have to sort of match buy and sell, and do that on a fractional the change at that point was the fractional share purchase and sale. And so for someone to get $100 from grandma over Christmas, or as a birthday gift, to be able to buy Google, you needed a fractional share option on a retail brokerage. And so that felt like something that was complementary. And so we knew that there was not going to be just one horse that wins that race. So over time, Fidelity figured out like, hey, how do we do this? How do we blend this in seamlessly to our platform so that the customer experience was seamless, right? So it's really at Fidelity about reducing all friction on the customer experience. I think that holds true in the ag sector as well. There are aspects of innovation and disruption where large ag businesses will probably opt out and let a lot of that friction get figured out, and let entrepreneurs work through that product market fit and be cheerleaders and be financiers of that, but then also find ways to bring that into be through exclusivity over time, or even as an acquisition. So
Right.
the business cycles are obviously different, right? Like a retail brokerage is such a fast business cycle. People can hop on the platform every day and trade differently. Buying seed, or having seed treatment done, or purchasing inputs through an online marketplace, that's a once or twice or three times in a season. It's not an every month scenario, right? So the cycle of opportunity to learn and to gain that customer traction, obviously that is the historic kind of friction in the marketplace within ag, and it's getting easier, right? You see that from everything from Farmers Edge to FBN and others. The question is long term, are prices being driven down and quality staying the same, or is there a trade-off at some point? And understanding those trade-offs, I think that's what the producers end up wanting to know at the end of the day, because they're trying to optimize the full farm budget, not just the input costs.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. So it sounds like it was, the up and comers were taken seriously. I mean, it was
Yeah.
more like maybe we can coexist, or if they really work, then we want to incorporate them
Yep.
as a part of our experience, or those ideas, rather than be the ones to really drive that. And then some of them got really big.
And I'll say,
time.
not in all cases was it comfortable for us to like call up and ask
Right.
for a meeting. There's a meeting that we had that I kind of had to shoehorn the Fidelity team into, and the CEO, was kind of standoffish at one point. It was like, look, I don't know why you guys want to have a meeting with me. Like, we're competitors. And it was really smart that the president that we had along on that trip just basically said, like, look, this is a big pie. Like, there's room for innovation. There's room for opportunity. There's room for customer, aggregation of experience on both sides. The pie will grow bigger if we do this well together. And it necessarily wasn't received equally as well, but there was a little friction initially to say, like, why do you guys want to know what I'm doing, and like my business model and whatnot? And it was about like finding ways to collaborate and align. It was great validation that probably 6 months later, that company actually signed a deal to use some of Fidelity's institutional services as a way to deconflict and sort of gain momentum in his business model. So another part of our business, Fidelity, was on the institutional side. And on the record keeping, it was built for scale, right? Like we could onboard 50,000 folks on a 401k, sort of plan seamlessly as a big company would shift from one 401k plan to another, and 50,000 people were, that's the size of some of the early stage, retirement online platforms. That's the total number of people that they had on their platform. So we were built for scale. And in the end of the day, we were able to offer a service on the institutional side. And that CEO was able to then go focus on something that was more closer to the customer. And that matched, right? That matched his model and momentum. And I think that's, the institutional finance connection back to, sort of input providers. There's an analogy there too, that there's room to advance innovation, both on the big enterprise because of scale and global reach. But we're not going to always do it all internally, right? So finding partners to do pieces and parts of that, and then even offer some of our services up to entrepreneurs to make their, core purpose more meaningful. To me, that's a very similar approach. And I think of like the Coase theorem of, transaction economics, like keep outsourcing until you get to the one thing that you can't do externally, and that's your core product or service. Right. So find partners, find the ecosystem that can do it faster, cheaper, on a better value basis, and then you'll get to your core. And there's room for that in the ag sector too. So, I think that's where we try to align on our investment thesis, where we can partner and offer some, aspect of value, whether it be market access or, insight into formulation, or, a view into the future of, chemistry registration in different markets, and find ways to bring that value back to our portfolio businesses. But that's the same, I think, that we did at Fidelity back in the day.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. It's kind of, I want to move a little bit from the market, right, and
Yep.
where we are as an ag tech market. In many ways, I agree with you. Where it feels so early, and I kind of reference internally, this is like fintech 10 years ago, right? It's kind of at this stage where things are starting to move, and now a lot more is possible, and that's why it's such an exciting time to be, in the industry. As far as like how, like more practical, when you look at agriculture products, that's what a lot of our article was about like what can, people building product, what can they learn from fintech that really resonated there. I think a massive difference in the market is that fintech largely is B2C, right? There's always consumer very close in the cycle, and ag tech almost always is B2B, until the very, very end of the supply chain in food. And usually at the beginning, right, at the farm level, you don't have a ton of access, right? There's not a really direct link to that today, at least. But anyway, I think it'd be really fun to kind of walk through these and kind of unroll some of the pieces of things that we saw, kind of pattern matching between fintech products and ag tech products. And one of the big ones for me is solving. It's not even solving new problems, right? It's taking existing solutions to existing problems and just doing it a lot better. So like the fractional trading, I think, is a perfect example. That's something where that's existed for a long, long time, right? And there are established players, but now if you do that in a different way, right? Maybe it's more scalable, or maybe it's just easier, or maybe it's more fun, or whatever it is, and that opens an entirely new category of, investing, and so do you think that I guess first, like, do you think that premise is reasonable to start looking at fintech and saying, well, what can we actually learn from their success? Or do you think that difference between B2B and B2C is so great that it doesn't really make sense to make this comparison?
I guess my mental model is that there's a B2B2C, angle, and that exists in both markets. Sort of the entry point, I think the differentiation is a lot of fintech went B2C right away. But they relied on core, sort of established institutional banking services. So there's a bank in headquartered out of San Francisco that basically used Bancorp as the background, but then, had a team of like 15 developers only, basically redoing the front end. And so that it was an online digital bank that was, basically focused at millennials, which is not where a lot of the other banks would focus, right? Because it's like, okay, so not, ultra high net worth folks, it's not a big, paycheck coming in every day, but there was a discontinuity between cash flow of like when the salary showed up and when it was available, and just like easy, no cost, debit ATM withdrawal, right? So they focused on something very simple, very honest, and their go-to-market. And I walked out of the, sort of the pitch in the session with their team, thinking like, this is just going to go gangbusters. Like Fidelity wasn't a commercial bank, but you could see that like the simplicity of this, they could not have done it without a very, established B2B player in Bancorp in the background doing all the management, right? So all the FINRA and FDIC management had to be done on a established platform, but it was available as a white label solution that customers never knew or never touched. And so that exists. I think so that fintech angle, I would say, to your point, there was a lot of B2C aspect that consumers are so desiring an experience that was easy, but also transparent. And you could even go way back into Mint, right? Like just the fact that you could aggregate all your accounts together and sort of export them on a CSV sounds like not very innovative today, but I still use my trove of data to sort of pattern match and track costs and sort of look for anomalies. And I'm still sort of a user of my Mint platform for a different purpose than it was 10 years ago. So they've adapted over that time, but that's a consumer version of what existed or lacked actually institutionally, because they started scraping websites initially before the APIs were built up. And there's a whole group of companies that ended up doing that well, like Yodlee, and obviously Quovo and Plaid ended up doing working into that space as well, making sure that verification and customer data was protected along the chain of that. I would say in ag, while there has been some like of that B2C equivalency, there's still a lot of opportunities in the B2B space. And there's maybe the difference is we are really at the horizon or like at the changing point where everything from new chemistry to new approaches to breeding and new solutions that whether it be biologics or sort of natural based chemistry, those things are impacting our environment and the ag sector in a way fundamentally as an industry that finance can't make the comparison, right? So if I said epigenetics is a new path for decreasing the breeding cycle, holding the Watson-Crick base pair of DNA stationary, but then adapting epigenetics to improve quality or durability or just change the size or the presence of colors. That did not, an equivalency of that does not exist essentially back in the fintech days. There were massive enterprise IT fundamentals that were changing, like things like Docker and the use of containers happened in the middle of the fintech revolution. And that made the enterprise IT infrastructure much more pliable. And then the move to the cloud, I'd say fintech was very much a laggard in that space, even after healthcare in some cases. But logistics and other industries had moved to the cloud. Fintech did that later, mostly because of regulatory concerns. But AWS was a leader there, managing through the FINRA relationship to get FINRA itself on the AWS cloud, and then bringing other companies along on a multi-cloud basis. So if there's I don't think it's just an equivalency in terms of like containers and like a Kubernetes orchestration system and the movement of DevOps. That is clearly transformational in enterprise IT and had a big impact on the cost basis and the ability to move quickly in fintech. But it is not equivalent in my mind to the major structural changes around like epigenetics and understanding like the protein library that DMind has opened up. Really fundamental changes in terms of biology and chemistry that are going to impact our food in the future. So problem set's a little bit different, but there are definitely tailwinds, right? In both cases, these are going to speed the level of innovation and disruption.
Yeah, and it's the Mint example is hilarious because in agriculture, I mean, if you think about like that really being this vanguard where, and I don't use it anymore, but I used to, and I loved it because you just had it all right there, and you get they give you a breakdown. And I think that's something that's still a lot of people struggle with in agriculture is how do I, and really at the farm level, like how do I think about this in a holistic way? And that's what a lot of companies are still building towards. So I think it's another point towards agtech being really early, even though it's been around for a long time, very early days.
Yep.
Yeah, and then it's really fascinating about the infrastructure side. Then I call it infrastructure broadly, but like Docker, Kubernetes, right? All of it, and AWS, right? Um, how these helped give a tailwind to fintech in that moment of growth for it, and the parallel to you know, biological research being a potential one in agriculture as well. Do you, and that's one of the things that we noted, but I actually don't have a ton of personal experience with, right? When I look at something like, you know, TransferWise or Venmo, the pitch that I always give when I'm talking about Leaf is, you know, these companies were able to scale and build so quickly in
Yep.
part because they were building on top of their peers, right? They were using Plaid to connect to all the different banks. So they were using, like, you know, Shopify using Stripe to build and process payments.
Yep.
And because of that, that was a really kind of force multiplier for them. From your experience, really actually being there and seeing it, is that true? I mean, is that really what it felt like? That another piece of that, and I think you kind of said this with like Docker and AWS, but do you think even that intra fintech infrastructure layer, like, was that a boost to fintech, or did it hold it
Oh,
back in any
absolutely.
ways?
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. I always envision the sort of the IT infrastructure of fintech like a Tetris game, right? Sort of, you know, when Docker arrived, it was like the 4 block laid on its side. Like, okay, now you can build, you know, multiple, you know, sort of value changes on this. And then, you know, AWS, like, you know, GPU, you know, spin ups, right? So you could actually, you know, spin up a number of GPUs very quickly in a dev or, you know, in a prod basis. You could regression test quickly on that. And, you know, the ability to sort of manage those even by on a container basis, I saw them as pieces and parts of like a Tetris game all kind of fitting together. And, you know, over time, some of those pieces are like timed out and you said, okay, I'm done with this infrastructure piece. It was good for the time being, but we have a new replacement for that. It does exist in ag. It's probably not as pronounced as sort of the IT infrastructure basis. But I would say if you sort of look at the, you know, a larger natural resource environmental impact, you can take, you know, sort of water, soil, and then, you know, even sort of the larger conversation on carbon, which I think is intermixed. But if you consider those as 3 pillars, the pieces and parts of those from a technology basis are a little bit like that Tetris game. You know, so if all water is, you know, green or blue, and then uh, all soil is brown, and then, you know, sort of carbon is a different color, you can see the pieces starting to fit together because we need to be able to, you know, essentially use remote sensing to, you know, both evaluate and capture, you know, sort of step change of carbon sequestration over time. And you can't do it with just one technology, right? Like from a soil carbon testing standpoint, you're still going to need labs and, you know, send the soil sample off to the lab, but we might have a different technology that you can go, you know, end row to end row and get a carbon assessment or characterization that is within the error rate of your soil sample, as long as you have like essentially the tie points, the ground truth figured out. So, you know, there's certainly businesses that are moving that angle. And so, you know, it's going to be another piece in that puzzle. And then there's going to be another one that says remote sensing can add, you know, another data layer. So that, you know, in part, that's why, you know, the Leaf thesis is so strong, is that it will continue to evolve with those sort of complementing data layers. And we are in ag not as far along as the fintech sector was in terms of, you know, a fully digital enterprise. We're still going from physical to digital in many cases, you know, and that's, you know, the percentage of variable rate tillers, for example, like it's probably less than 10% in the field in North America at this point. But it's certainly the future rather than the past. And so, you know, the bet that we're going to be able to, you know, get to real time, you know, tillage prescriptions so that you can just drive down the field and you know that you need to have, you know, an 18-inch chisel plow, or you can, you know, deal with a 3-inch ripper. You know, there's a span of opportunity there that also then plays back to soil health and then carbon sequestration and even moisture management. So I think, you know, those are my categories. That the Tetris example fits a lot better on the environmental side, I think, because we're early days and it is such a reinforcing, you know, sort of equation uh, of soil and health, and all soils are different. Right, so building up that sort of even a global database of soil profiles would be exciting. Um,
Yeah, yeah. The other tailwind too is that Agtech can still benefit from that that cloud infrastructure too, right? Because that hasn't slowed down. You know, I think that's the other exciting thing. It's accelerated in some cases.
and frankly, the Agtech demands on that infrastructure are not as high as the fintech. So the fintech, you know, we were pushing on Amazon even like 4 years ago about, streaming data, being able to like stream data, at scale and then cache a certain amount of it and then run algos based on, the cache as well as the data in flight. So the government's been doing this for years, but it's hard to figure out which data you want to throw away. So from a learning and AI and ML set, you want to get as much good data in as possible, do some cleansing of it, and then run your models, and then apply that to the data that's in flight coming through. The demand for that in fintech was enormous compared to where we are in ag tech, in my opinion. And that's it just means that our requirements are a little bit different and probably not as stringent. Which means we can take it so much more benefit of the cost structure that's already gone in the favor of anyone in a digital and ag space.
Absolutely. And I think that's going to change pretty dramatically too, as you look at like some of the, I talk about like measurement, reporting, verification of soil, right? That's just the amount of data, but then also processing and model training, whatever it is, whatever it ultimately becomes. I think that could become a huge piece of it. And I love like Descartes Labs. They publish their I don't know what you call it. It's like semi-technical posts on how they scaled to this massive supercomputer on AWS, whatever. Those are really fun. Yeah. How do you, and I'm going a little bit off topic, but another interesting thing that I see in agriculture is kind of these offshoots, right? You have these new categories out, maybe not new categories, but you have these very hot categories today. And I think carbon sustainability, compliance,
Sure.
that's really, in the past year, it's really taken off. You see a little bit of this too in fintech, I'll say, and then maybe also retail, right? As these things, and they really become hot as more companies start building there, and these models that maybe have been tried or maybe have been around, they're actually really starting to work because they have the right model now, they have distribution plans, and maybe they have the tech behind them too. Are there any parallels there to fintech? Are there any like large movements that kind of, I'm not going to say overnight, but very quickly change the landscape of what people were oriented around in that industry?
Yeah, maybe the easiest analogy, it's sort of a quick reaction to that would be, when the finance industry started moving towards index funds and passively managed funds, it really felt new and different. And sort of the actively managed funds, sort of went through a phase of like, what is their value proposition? And, are the fees associated with that rightly aligned with the outcomes? And it took a couple cycles to sort of work through that. I think on the fintech side to think through, all right, so when there was like a high volatility day in the market, a couple of those passively managed sort of platforms actually had to stop trading, and that felt like it was almost like outside the EULA, right? Like if you signed up to be ability to actively manage your own funds, but let it sit in a passively managed account, like if you were told that you couldn't transact, that felt just like a discontinuity. And so I think that felt pretty dramatic at the time. And Vanguard had always had a really great set of funds. And the interesting thing about the funds network is that there's a lot of frenemies, right? So the place where the comparison breaks down is that the SEC and FINRA, have a lot of oversight to make sure that customers, whether it be a retail customer or a 401k, plan participant, are getting the access to the equitable amount of sort of financial instruments. So that meant Fidelity had to carry Vanguard funds, and Vanguard, and Morgan Stanley had to carry Fidelity funds, and so that's part of that sort of 401k network built upon the policies that were very much top down in the U.S. From a federal government standpoint. That doesn't exist so much in ag, right? Like there's retailer relationships, and each input provider has to provide and build value in that retail channel. And there are ways to sort of disintermediate that channel, but there's a lot of momentum and force in that is for goodness, right? Like it gets products at scale distributed globally for a good reason. But over time, there's always going to be a little bit of friction in that network, I think. But we don't have the same level of oversight when it comes to like the FIN or SEC. There's not an equivalent body within the USDA or EPA, like, some shared responsibilities. It's just different regulation and oversight from the federal government. So that, I think that doesn't always fit together, but I would say, kind of going back to that passive fund, and you think about iSelect and other passively managed funds and index funds, Spider and whatnot. That was a really big turning point, and I feel like that's, if there was sort of a moment that gave investors a time to really think about, like, what is the future of finance, and do I need actively managed funds, and how do I build net worth over time, over dollar cost averaging? Again, the cycle's different, but some of the same risk management concerns are the same in ag. And so,
Right.
how do you get product to market on a scalable basis on demand, right? Can I order seeds from company A, have it processed and have a seed treatment by company B, have a company C do the distribution back to my farm place? That still feels a little clunky and not normal from a full chain supply system. But in my mind, I want to think about, like, in 15 years, are we actually printing seeds, pretty close to on site? Like, can we get to a point of like an equivalent of like 3D printing, but genetic, sort of manufacturing? And it's total fanciful, and it's totally, sort of a visionary approach, but can we get to the point where we're, thinking about, really transformational approaches to seed management, whether it be trait management, seed distribution, all the way, so the grower gets exactly the specialty crop that he or she wants, and that farmer can put that seed in ground and actually grow and have a marketplace that's viable from a farm budget standpoint.
Right. And I'm right there with you. I love thinking about those. I think like, and a lot of this, I think in the context of applications and infrastructure that supports them, and so you start thinking about those kinds of applications. It's like, okay, well, what needs to be true for that to actually be possible, or more likely practical, right? Like,
Right.
or more importantly, practical, right? Where is that suddenly attainable? And then, what are the most valuable things to build next in that context?
Yeah, and my seed
fun.
printing idea is a total moonshot idea, but if you sort of use it as a running platform to say, what acres do we put towards seed production, and what is the carbon footprint of that, and could we refactor this into some 3D printed germplasm, is that viable at some level in the next 15 years? I'd love to think the answer is yes, right? And that's that in itself is sort of a major leap that gets us to think about, like, what is finance when the underlying asset of every single entity that you own as an equity. I think that would be the analogy, and we're getting there. Finance is trying to figure out, can you carbon footprint every entity in a portfolio?
Right.
It'll probably take another decade, so that you can look at your Magellan mutual fund and say, every share of Magellan equals X carbon footprint, and people can clearly make value judgments and investment decisions based upon that.
Yeah. No, I'm right there with you. And I think, as we think about consumers getting closer to the cycle too, one step further, right? Imagine, like, as a consumer, you can choose the traits that you want in your lettuce or whatever, right? where you want, and that might be still in that category of extreme. But I'm right there with you. I think that would be a wonderful place for us to be in 15 years as an industry. But it's going to take a lot of work. I just have two more like wrap up questions, and then like 100 offline questions.
We need to do this more often, is what it comes down to.
Exactly, we do. It's fascinating. The offline question I'm going to ask you is about like open banking, because it's very often championed as like what unlocks fintech. And for me, it just I never, that really never sat well with me, because screen scraping was really how it happened from my perspective, at least. Anyway, my last
that's a standards discussion at the end of the day. Right.
Exactly.
So, there's a number of open banking initiatives, a lot of them came out of the like Columbia MBA class of like 2000, 2002, and it was a standards issue, right? So if you get big banks to say no to standards or develop their own, then an open standard will unlikely to prosper.
And it's really hard to revert back, right? Once it's already been established,
Yeah.
It's a fun question though. Anyway, my last two are, they're very generic, but are you excited about the future of agriculture? And I think you already answered that with printing, seeds. But are you excited about it, right? Maybe like which categories are you most excited about agriculture? And then my second one, which is related, is if you were starting to build something new in the ag tech industry today, how would you get started? right? I think that is kind of, there are a lot of barriers to entry still. And we want to do everything we can to change that, right? Whether
Yep.
it's through education or of course, technology, direct approach there. But yeah, how would you do it?
Yeah. So maybe the last question first is, how do you do it? And then we'll come back to the other one. So, I think it really does, sort of use the tropism of it takes a village. Like it takes a lot of different actors to get a solid startup, and put legs to it. I've talked to founders where I've invested as an angel and they declined to take, capital from a corporate investor for their price Series A. And, in retrospect, I've been told in, a more like nice conversation, like, man, we probably should have taken capital from a strategic, like it would have gotten us into a different location. Hindsight's always 2020, but the story is apt to say, it takes friends and family, and it takes, for capital to get going. It takes a vision and a smart team in setting the DNA in the right zone, and then it takes, some financial investors that are willing to take the bet early in the seed stage. Family offices are fabulous in ag, and that's a difference in finance. If you can find the family office, connected, obviously the well-known, obviously Cargill family, the Walton family, there's strong passion around conservation, around understanding the supply chain, around really moving global markets. So it's sort of the best of both worlds of philanthropy plus sort of industry knowledge and the ability to open doors. And then being able to raise capital. I think that it's interesting that there's a lot of focus on sustainability now. In my mind, like it's always been a fundamental underpinning thesis within ag. Like no one goes to ag to say we're going to use more energy, more carbon footprint.
Right.
We're going to make it harder for farmers. Like ag is a relationship driven business, but it's based upon some pragmatism. And at the end of the day, like that pragmatism is about sustainability. And I'm a farm kid. I grew up, in a like 400 acres of a homestead farm in Southwest Minnesota. At the end of the day, the asset is the land, and every farmer, especially in the small and mid-sized farmers, want to increase the value of their asset and pass it on to the next generation. And they do that through hard work, through relationships, and through persistence of sort of seasonality issues like prevent planting and derecho storms. And each of those farmers are entrepreneurs at the end of the day. They're dealing with crisis and capital cash flow. So we owe it to them to provide as much sort of stability as possible and present new solutions that really make a difference and move the needle. So for entrepreneurs, they need access to that base, and that I think strategics open up a large sort of trove of opportunities to have those conversations. But like any other good design, MVPs, get in the market, talk to your customers, and move quickly to iterate. A much more of a Stanford D School design modality than waterfall. And so, find ways to innovate, find partnerships, align, and then you sort of, run quickly and then take a pause and, take stock. And that being able to do that on an iterative basis with a team that really values like the mission, that matters. For me, I'm excited, that ties right into, one of the things I really believe in at the end of the day is solving food insecurity. And for me, this tie-in of environmental purpose and food insecurity, and that could be, a small holder in Africa, and it could be a kid in, downtown Watts, LA, or it could be a kid that lives down the street from me here. Like food insecurity exists everywhere, and the ability for us as participants in this food and ag business to really think about that and actually drive, the stress and the nutritional component of food insecurity down and make food and not just empty calories, but like a full balanced portfolio of calories available, like a full, really nutritious, diet to me is like, that's my guiding light. And being able to work through that on everything from environmental impact all the way through nutrition at the table is part of, what drives me every day.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful. It's great. I mean, you're right. The health insecurity, the food insecurity, super important. And then kind of the weird thing that I get excited about, just to play on that, is what comes after that, right? Like, how do you start optimizing food beyond, right, just like health insecurity, which of course, right, is the first problem. But how far can you push through those avenues too? So that's great. I'd love to hear it.
That's the next conversation. So let's talk about durability and nutrition in our diet.
Exactly. Exactly. Awesome. Well, Ryan, thank you so much.
You bet.
This was great.